Michael Yonchak, Associate Director of Bands at Otterbein, also Associate Department Chair and Assistant Professor of Music Education. I think it's an awful mistake, and the reason it is an awful mistake is because the way that we are approaching education holistically is with a strong focus on reading and math/science/technology skills, which is only one component of how K-12 students learn. Creativity is going to come out in some way. Now, whether or not we are enablers and facilitators of that, or if it's just going to be a reaction to a lack of opportunities to do that is something that's remained to be seen. It's an easy line item deduction because folks, in my opinion, don't necessarily understand how to qualify or quantify it. I mean, with math and with English language arts, I mean, there's, on some levels, there's an amount of data that comes out that you can measure whether or not a students are successful or not. They can either read or they can't. They can either add and subtract or they can't. But in regards to the arts, not necessarily just music, but also in drama, also in visual art, also in any of a variety of different things, that they're very subjective judgments that we make on those products. You know, if a student produces a work in watercolor, on the base level, there are watercolor paints applied to a canvas, and yes, it is a watercolor piece. But how successful is the student using techniques of shading, techniques of perspective, shapes, forms? You know, it really comes down to the judgment of that specific teacher. So, you know, in that respect, I think that there's a real push to have measurable data. And in the fine arts, you can, to a point, measure that, but at some point it has to be there because it's its own thing. That's a very convoluted answer, but... Well, the stock answer is higher test scores in reading and math, which, you know, kind of goes along with the snake oil within the Mozart effect. You know, it stimulates a different type of brain activity, which I think could possibly be a scientific study that may have happened. If it has, I don't know about it or I haven't read it yet. But it's a balance, and I think for me personally, there's a lot in my teaching and in my pedagogy that's reflecting in everything has to be in balance, everything in moderation. You know, so you can have the statistical and analytical math and science stuff, but at the same time you have to have equal parts of creativity that really has no parameters, where the students are free to explore. And I think that's the one element that's really missing from today's educational plan, is that the students aren't allowed to just be. They aren't allowed to just experiment and explore. It all has to be structured. It all has to have parameters and definable outcomes. It's like, well, you know, what's wrong with a kid just exploring on a xylophone? Like, give them a pair of mouths, watch what happens. You know, who knows? In my dealings with high school and middle school directors, as a supervisor of student teachers, I'm watching the front line of these educators who are dealing with new assessment testing. They're dealing with new student learning objectives, any of the new the alphabet soup things that are coming down from Capitol Hill. They're not happy about it. On one end, some folks will make the argument that, you know, well, how can you possibly measure music, blah, blah, blah. The other end of it is that, well, we can assess certain things. Now, to what degree that happens is another story, and do we standardize that assessment across the board for everybody, you know? So would a school like Worthington have similar outcomes than a school like Centennial? You know, like two very different music programs with two very different pedagogical approaches. They're both doing good work, but, you know, you have to meet the needs of that population of students. So what works at Worthington may not necessarily work at Centennial. I don't know if I can say that I know people who have officially lost their jobs because of it. It has happened, but I don't know those people personally. so I can't really speak to that effect. But from my own experience in K-12 education, administrators are more than likely to take a look at the fine arts program and athletics before they're going to start making cuts to core content areas like math and science and language arts. Really, it comes down to the almighty dollar. I mean, it's expensive to run a band program, it's expensive to run an orchestra, it's expensive to run any kind of creative outlet, because if you're, and this is going to sound really awful, but if you're dealing in language arts, you know what you need to get the job done. When you're dealing with a creative component, you know, you have an idea of what you need to accomplish the goal, but you're never quite sure where that program's going to go. So you can plan as best as you can, but at the same time, it may take a turn where you have to invest more capital to meet the needs of the students and where they're going. You know, you want to be an enabler and a facilitator for their creative exploration, but at the same time, you want to make sure that you have the resources available to do that. So it's, part of it is budget, part of it is when the state report cards come out at the end of the year to show whether or not a school has met average yearly progress or was adequate yearly progress, or you know, whether they're excellent with distinction or failing or whatever. The arts don't factor into those equations because there's no current standardized test. I'm sure it's coming. Somebody's thinking this up because it is a great way to make tons of money. So it's one of those things where, okay, we need to invest all of our resources into the things that we're actually being measured on, the things that dictate how much money we're going to be getting from the state to maintain these schools. You know, so yeah, if we have a marching band, great. If we have an orchestra, great. But they're really kind of pushed off to the side and say, okay, we really need to make sure that our students who are reading at a 4th grade level in 8th grade are getting every single opportunity to boost their performance so that, you know, our report card comes out and we keep our money. I have 2 answers to that, and one is less appropriate than the other. The first one is to support the arts, which is a very generic, yeah, you should. You should go to concerts, you should, you know, lobby with administrators to, as a parent, as an educator, as a community member, like, yeah, this is really important. You know, and yeah, go through your whole day without turning the radio on and see what happens. Right, we've heard this story 1,000 times. The other end of it is that I think that the current model of arts education that we're working from is severely dated. We're essentially working on a 1950s architecture to teach a 21st century learner. If you think just in general, the way that schools are set up, it's essentially a factory model. The bell rings, the kids get up, they move to the next thing. So it models that manufacturing idea, at least it did in the 50s, around that time. Now you have a much more diverse learner. You have learners that are coming to the table with much different skills that aren't necessarily measurable in the standard context of the 1950s. Of, well, you have reading, you have math, you have science, you have all this other stuff. As far as promoting the arts, I think we really need to overhaul how we approach arts education. And I think of that as somebody who works with pre-service teachers. You know, essentially when kids graduate with a music ed degree, they are either going to be a band director, a choir director, an orchestra director, or a general music teacher. That's it. There are no other avenues for anything. And unfortunately, those are the 4 areas that all K-12 schools have, and they don't really think outside of that construct because, to quote Dr. Underwood, we've always had the lottery. We've always had this, it's always worked, we'll just keep it working. But the problem is that we have students going into these programs that are approaching it, you can still teach them the content, but it's not going to be through those 4 vehicles. It's going to have to be through something else, like technology. It's going to have to be through electric guitars. It's going to have to be through popular music. It's going to have to be through video games. You know, things that this structure is not equipped to handle. So in order to save the arts, I think we really need to overhaul and reevaluate our entire approach, which, you know, I could say that easily because I don't know how that's going to happen. You know, all I can say is that's the problem, but I don't have a solution or an alternative. So that, I think the person who thinks that up is really going to be, you know, the messiah of the new education age. So, you know, who knows? We'll just keep cracking our heads and see what happens.